It's 1995. Charles de Gaulle Airport, Paris. Every day, tens of thousands of passengers move through Terminal 1. They arrive, they depart, they disappear into the world. But one man never leaves. He sits on a red plastic bench, reading. The staff call him Sir Alfred. He has been here for 7 years. He will remain for 11 more. No country will claim him. No border will open for him. This is Mehran Karimi Nasseri. His 18-year tragedy didn't begin at this airport. It began decades earlier, when his own country erased him. The story begins in Masjid Soleiman, an oil production town in Iran's southwestern province of Khuzestan. Mehran Karimi Nasseri was born there in 1945, the son of an Iranian physician and a homemaker. His early life was comfortable, middle class, and seemingly secure. Yet, the foundations of his identity were complex, shaped by family accounts of a mother with Scottish roots, a maternal connection that would eventually dominate his personal mythology, and his lifelong search for British belonging. In September 1973, Nasseri left the oil fields of Khuzestan for the United Kingdom, enrolling in a 3-year Yugoslav studies program at the University of Bradford in West Yorkshire. The mid-1970s was a period of intense political friction both in Britain and among the global Iranian diaspora. Far from home, Nasseri joined a small circle of exiled students protesting the authoritarian rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He participated in demonstrations, carried placards denouncing the monarchy, and aligned himself with the opposition, unaware of the consequences these actions would carry. When he returned to Iran in 1977, his life fractured. Nasseri later reported that state security forces arrested him, confiscated his passport, and expelled him from the country for his anti-regime activism. Though the Iranian government has disputed this version of events, security records from the era list his name among those flagged for political dissent. Whether formal expulsion occurred or he was simply forced to flee, the outcome was absolute. Nasseri was cast out, unable to return to his homeland, and left to wander a world that demands official documentation for the basic right to exist. For the next decade, Western Europe became a shifting map of temporary stays and sudden expulsions. Nasseri drifted through the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and West Germany, always searching for a permanent home. Because he lacked a valid passport, authorities in multiple countries detained him and ordered him to leave. In 1984, Belgium's Office for the Protection of Refugees formally granted him refugee status under the 1951 Convention. This designation offered a fragile shield, allowing him to travel across certain European borders, but it did not restore his nationality. His legal survival rested entirely on a physical briefcase containing his official refugee papers. Long before he ever encountered the transit zone in Paris, Nasseri had become a man defined by this vulnerability, learning firsthand that without the state's written permission, a person is legally invisible. On August 26, 1988, Mehran Karimi Nasseri arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. He was carrying his briefcase, intending to board a flight to London to search for the woman he believed to be his British mother. But somewhere during his transit, either on the Paris train system or within the busy airport terminals, his vital refugee documents vanished. Whether they were stolen from his side or deliberately discarded remains a subject of unresolved dispute. Without these papers, he was instantly stripped of his legal identity, his history, and his right to move. He boarded a flight to London Heathrow anyway, relying on hope rather than official proof. Upon landing, British immigration officials immediately flagged him. Without a passport or a valid travel document, he could not be admitted into the United Kingdom. Exercising standard border procedures, British officials placed him on the next outbound flight back to Paris. When Nasseri returned to Charles de Gaulle, the true legal trap snapped shut. French border police arrested him for arriving without documentation, but they faced an immediate, insurmountable obstacle. They could not deport him because he had no recognized country of origin willing to accept him, and they could not release him into France. This created a profound administrative deadlock. The French state resolved this impasse through a legal fiction known as non-entry. Under French immigration frameworks, the space between the aircraft gates and the border control checkpoints, the international transit zone, is treated as a legal vacuum. Within this zone, a traveler is physically present but legally non-entered. Refusal of entry was technically distinct from conventional deportation, meaning French authorities could hold him in this space indefinitely without granting him the legal rights of someone who had entered the country. Nasseri was suspended in a bureaucratic no-man's land, a physical body in a transit hub, with no recognized destination and no legal path forward. The public departure lounge of Terminal 1 became a permanent home. For 18 years, Mehran Karimi Nasseri occupied a single red plastic bench, keeping his few possessions neatly organized in cardboard boxes and vinyl suitcases beside him. Above him, the harsh glare of fluorescent lighting remained constant, erasing the distinction between day and night, while the steady hum of terminal announcements and the distant roar of jet engines became his constant soundtrack. While millions of travelers rushed past on their way to destinations across the globe, Nasseri existed in a state of absolute stillness. He structured his days with quiet, predictable routines. He read newspapers, studied books, and filled page after page of spiral notebooks with diary entries, capturing the monotonous passage of time in a world that never stopped moving. The circular terminal functioned as both a protective shelter and a physical confinement. Without official status, Nasseri relied on the informal care of the airport community. Terminal employees, flight crews, and medical staff became his primary social circle, offering small gestures of humanity in a starkly bureaucratic space. They provided him with hot meals, let him use their staff facilities for showers, and brought him reading materials. Over time, the name Mehran Karimi Nasseri receded, replaced by the nickname Sir Alfred, an appellation coined by a British immigration official and adopted by everyone from postal workers to security guards. He was a familiar fixture, a man who belonged to the terminal but possessed no legal right to step outside its glass doors. This existence was legally cemented by a reported 1992 French court ruling. The court determined that because Nasseri had arrived legally as a recognized refugee, the state could not forcibly expel him from the airport's international zone. Yet, this legal protection did not resolve his lack of ordinary residence. The ruling merely declared his presence in the transit area untouchable. It did not grant him a visa, a passport, or the right to walk into the country surrounding the airport. It codified the deadlock, leaving him legally trapped on his red bench. The staff's ongoing kindness offered practical support, but it could never substitute for formal legal residence. As the years stretched into decades, a quiet celebrity grew around the man on the bench. Journalists arrived with cameras and microphones, trying to understand the figure who lived in public view, yet remained entirely isolated. He gave interviews on his red bench, a minor celebrity in a transit hub. For Nasseri, the airport had transformed from a temporary transit point into a complete world. The constant movement of travelers contrasted sharply with his static existence, showing the clear disconnect between global mobility and stateless immobility. He remained stranded in plain sight, a living symbol of the human cost of a world divided by borders he could neither cross nor escape. In 1995, the Belgian government presented a potential pathway out of the airport. Belgian authorities prepared a supervised residency package that would have allowed Nasseri to live in Belgium under the oversight of their Office for the Protection of Refugees. The necessary paperwork was finalized in Brussels, but the administrative process required Nasseri to travel there in person to retrieve it. He refused the opportunity. His French human rights lawyer, Christian Bourget, explained that while Belgian authorities were prepared to facilitate his transfer, Nasseri simply declined, stating that his life had become the airport. This decision was closely tied to a conflict over identity. The Belgian documents were issued under his birth name, Mehran Karimi Nasseri, and identified him as an Iranian national. He rejected these terms, claiming the papers failed to recognize his self-chosen name, Sir Alfred, and his asserted British heritage. 4 years later, the French administration attempted to resolve the impasse. In 1999, acting on the 1992 court ruling, French officials prepared an official residency permit, or titre de séjour, which would have granted him legal residence, housing, and medical coverage in France. Yet, the paperwork again identified him as Mehran Karimi Nasseri and listed his country of origin as Iran. Once more, he refused to sign. He argued that the identity on the document was incorrect, stating that the person named on the paper was not him. In the years that followed, early interviews and articles, including a notable account published in Cabinet magazine, highlighted his persistent objection to any document that labeled him an Iranian citizen or misspelled his name. For Nasseri, accepting the documents meant accepting a nationality and an identity he had spent years trying to shed. These refusals altered the nature of his confinement. The bureaucratic barriers that originally trapped him at Charles de Gaulle were now accompanied by his own decisions. The situation became a complex mix of state rules and individual will. Rather than an easily defined legal tragedy, his continued stay on the red bench became a matter of personal choice, even as the lack of flexible state procedures left him with no middle ground. He chose to remain in the transit zone of Terminal 1, where he could preserve the identity of Sir Alfred, rather than step into a world that required him to sign away the self he had created. In 2003, Hollywood took notice of the man on the red bench. Steven Spielberg's production company, DreamWorks, bought the rights to Mehran Karimi Nasseri's life story, paying him for the narrative of his confinement. This transaction transformed his isolated existence into a global commodity, leading to the 2004 release of the film The Terminal. Starring Tom Hanks as a fictional traveler from a manufactured Eastern European nation, the movie used Nasseri's basic situation as a starting point for a bittersweet comedy drama. But the film was a loose adaptation, a sanitized fiction designed for international audiences. On screen, the character navigates a brightly lit terminal, eventually winning his freedom, finding love, and stepping out into the streets of New York. It was a comforting cinematic resolution, offering closure to a premise born of systematic exclusion. For Nasseri, there was no scripted escape. The cash from the film rights arrived, but it could not buy him a recognized state, a valid passport, or a peace of mind. While audiences watched a heartwarming resolution in theaters worldwide, the real Sir Alfred remained on his plastic bench in Terminal 1, surrounded by his cardboard boxes. The cinematic fantasy of departure only highlighted the grim reality of his confinement, where the credits never rolled, and the terminal doors remained closed. In July 2006, the long, public period of Mehran Karimi Nasseri's life at Charles de Gaulle Airport came to an end. Medical personnel escorted him from Terminal 1 in an ambulance, responding to a steady decline in his physical health. This removal ended his continuous residency of 18 years, moving him from the transit zone into a hospital for medical evaluation. Once discharged from the hospital, Nasseri did not return to Terminal 1. Instead, he entered the French social shelter system, moving through various Paris area shelters that offered basic accommodation away from the constant movement of the airport. For 16 years, he lived in these facilities, spending a period in quiet obscurity, away from the international spotlight that had once surrounded his daily routine. Although he remained stateless, he received support from charity organizations and managed his daily expenses using the funds remaining from his story rights. Yet, this temporary stability did not resolve his lack of official identity. In September 2022, he returned to Charles de Gaulle Airport. Bypassing the social care network that had supported him, he walked back through the doors of the terminal of his own accord. He settled in the public area of Terminal 2F, arranging his few belongings in the terminal space. The airport was no longer a forced confinement, but a familiar environment where he could exist, choosing the familiar sounds of passengers over the isolation of the shelters. This final period was brief. On November 12, 2022, Nasseri suffered a heart attack inside the terminal. Airport emergency services responded immediately, but they were unable to revive him. He died in Terminal 2F at the age of 77. Among his remaining possessions, authorities discovered several thousand euros. The exact source and amount of these funds were never officially verified, reflecting the quiet ambiguity that accompanied him to his final hours. His death brought a somber close to a life defined by displacement. He passed away as he had lived, a man without a recognized state, resting in the transient halls of an international terminal, leaving behind a story of legal limbo that outlived the man who experienced it. The 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons defines a stateless person as someone who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. This definition reveals a precise and challenging legal reality. Statelessness is distinct from refugee status, which requires a well-founded fear of persecution in one's home country. It is also different from undocumented status, where an individual possesses a nationality, but simply lacks the physical papers to prove it. International law treats legal residence, nationality, and identity recognition as entirely separate categories. Because of this separation, a person can be granted the right to reside in a territory without ever receiving the protective shield of its nationality, remaining legally invisible even while physically present in a community. While circulating claims often suggest that tens of millions of people exist in this exact form of legal limbo, global statistics vary significantly based on definitions and reporting methods. The latest authoritative figures from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees recorded approximately 4.5 million stateless individuals worldwide at the end of 2025. To prevent double counting in national databases, this net estimate of 4,362,272 people excludes the 1.6 million stateless individuals who are also classified as forcibly displaced. For these millions, this legal limbo does not usually unfold on a public airport bench in the heart of Europe. Instead, it takes the form of prolonged detention in administrative centers, severely restricted physical movement, a total lack of work authorization, and limited access to basic education or emergency health care. Indefinite uncertainty dominates their daily lives. Nasseri's 18-year stay in Terminal 1 is not a universal representation of this global population. His experience was highly unusual, static, and heavily publicized. Most stateless people live in quiet obscurity, far from the cameras of international journalists and filmmakers. Yet, his singular ordeal acts as a clear, historical lens. It exposes the harsh rigidity of modern asylum procedures, the gaps in international human rights treaties, and the acute vulnerability of individuals who fall outside state protection. His life on the red bench was not merely a curious anomaly, but a stark, melancholic reminder of the human cost when identity systems and border laws fail to accommodate those who have nowhere legally to belong. Nasseri's red bench is gone, but the global machinery of exclusion remains. Today, millions of stateless people still navigate their own invisible terminals, trapped by a world that values paperwork over human existence. His tragedy reminds us that without a recognized home, a person becomes a ghost in plain sight. What are your thoughts on his legacy? Let us know in the comments.